Chapter 12, the sections go their ways. So the sections that we're referring to are obviously North and South as we increasingly move toward the Civil War. So in this chapter, we'll look at the economy of the South, slavery in the South, and how that affected slaves and slaveholders in terms of sociology and psychologically, what manufacturing in the South looked like, and then what manufacturing in the North looked like, the effects of immigrants on our nation, foreign commerce, and then the transportation revolution with steamboats and railroads. The South. So by this point, regional differences had emerged between North and South as each of those sections developed distinctive economic systems and workforces. So the South, we know, was less affected than the North by urbanization or city building, was less affected by European immigration, the transportation revolution, and industrialization. The South remained predominantly agricultural, and there was an emphasis there on cotton and slavery, especially in South Carolina. So the cultivation of cotton and tobacco actually expanded westward, while some of the older sections of Maryland and Virginia and North Carolina began to diversify their agriculture, just meaning that they were growing things other than cotton and tobacco. But since cotton and tobacco was so profitable, those were cash crops, and that expanded westward. So by this point, the agricultural revolution that had hit Europe had reached the United States as well. So farmers were experimenting with different types of fertilizer, crop rotation, new agricultural practices, and even a variety of crops that would help improve agricultural productivity. The economics of slavery. So what did this look like from an economic perspective in the South? Well, we know that because cotton became more important in the South's economy, it strengthened slavery's hold on the region. And as the price of slaves increased, particularly in the Deep South, slave trading became a big business. And we know that the slave trade obviously had disastrous effects on slaves, families separated, just people being whipped and beaten and treated poorly. And that wasn't certainly the case every time, but slavery really didn't benefit the slave or the slaveholder. But as slaves became more expensive, the ownership of slaves became more concentrated. That just means that it was only the top percentage of Americans who could afford to have slaves, or certainly a lot of slaves. So by 1860, about 25% of Southern families owned slaves. Relatively speaking, the South had very few large plantations and many small farms. Small farms grew staple crops and owned few slaves. So small farms wouldn't be growing tobacco and cotton. They would be growing like corn or beans or rice, some type of food crop probably. And plantations, which were large slaveholding lands and families, lots of slaves, could yield high profits. But the Southerners didn't really develop facilities for marketing or transportation. So a lot of times the profit from handling the crop went largely to northern merchants and middlemen because they were the ones with the marketing and the transportation that the South lacked. So Southern money or Southern capital was tied up in land and slaves, and therefore wasn't really available for investment in other things. And I think that would be one thing that turned out to hurt the South economically, is because so much of their money was tied up in land and slaves that they couldn't invest elsewhere. So under slavery, Southern blacks remained a non-consuming class, and much of the intelligence and talent and abilities of the slave population were wasted. All right, antebellum plantation life, and I just want to hone in on this word antebellum. The word ante means before, bellum in reference to war. So this is just talking about slavery before the war. And of course, the war that we're talking about here is the Civil War. So you'll see that word thrown around a lot in the chapters just before the Civil War: antebellum agriculture, or antebellum slavery, or antebellum economics. It has to do with those things as they existed before the war. So the typical antebellum plantation was more like a small village than a farm. Planters bought luxuries and manufactured goods, but the plantation itself produced most of the household needs and almost all of the food that was consumed by the family and by the slave. So the plantation itself was self-sufficient. Like, it could feed the people. The wife would make clothing and things like that. And so what they spent their money on was luxury goods, manufactured goods. The master exercised paternal authority over the plantation. So he was like the leading male dominant figure, maybe like a father in some instances. And the wife had domestic responsibilities. She was typically in charge of running the household, supervising the slaves, maybe nursing the sick, planning the meals, and saw to the education of her children as well as the training of young slaves. So the wife of these families was busy as well. And at the same time, she was also expected to be a refined, gracious Southern lady. So she had to work that into her schedule as well. Most of the slaves worked in the field, but some were employed as like household servants or sometimes even artisans on the plantation. And though the slave quarters were simple and crude, they were compared favorably with houses of European peasants. The sociology of slavery. It's difficult to generalize about slavery because so much depended on the individual master's behavior and how he treated his slaves. When we read Uncle Tom's Cabin, we saw a variety of masters and how they treated their slaves differently. But most owners provided adequate food, clothing, and shelter for their slaves, who they considered to be valuable property. Still, slaves had a higher rate of infant mortality and a lower life expectancy than whites. So that means that the medical care that they received was probably not as good as what the whites were receiving. The United States was the only slave society in the Western Hemisphere whose slave population grew by natural increase. So even after the slave trade was gone in the United States, the slave population still grew because slaves were reproducing. That meant that in the United States, it was the only place where slaves lived long enough to have children and to raise those children. So I guess in a sense, slaves were treated better in the United States than they were in other places in the Western Hemisphere. Whatever their material condition was, slaves had no rights. For their part, slaves accommodated themselves to the system while attempting to resist oppression. And this peculiar institution, as it was called, hardened as Northern opposition to slavery grew and Southerners worried about insurrection. So as we move closer to the Civil War, you see slaveholders tightening down on their slaves and restricting their rights even more, to the point where they forbid them to learn to read and write. Slavery remained an essentially rural institution, and its existence contributed to the rural nature of the South. Country life in the South at this time was defined by slavery. Not all blacks in the South were slaves. However, whites took a dim view of free blacks and tried as hard as they could to restrict their freedom. Psychological effects of slavery. With few exceptions like Denmark Vesey, most slaves were resigned to their fate. And they didn't really try to buck the system because it had been ingrained in them that they were property and nothing more. I mentioned Denmark Vesey. He was a slave who won a lottery and purchased his freedom at the age of 32. And after being a free black for about 20 years, buying back his wife and their children, he was accused and hanged in 1822 of being a ringleader of a major slave rising in Charleston, South Carolina. But like I said, most slaves were just not okay with their fate, but they submitted to it. The system fostered submissiveness and discouraged any independent self-reliance on the part of the blacks. In spite of that, slaves maintained strong family and group attachments, as well as a culture and religious nature of their own. Slavery inevitably affected the master class as well. The patriarchal nature of the slave system reinforced male dominance in the South. And with that, some slave owners behaved nobly and took their male dominance to a noble level, I guess you could say, when they treated their slaves well within the confines of the institution. And for others, slaves provided objects on which to vent their brutal tendencies. So this affected the master class and the slave class as well. So we'll end there and then pick up with manufacturing in the South and the North on the next video.